So Tim, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight.
Oh, well, thank you. I am bringing greetings from Glenetta Kraus because she was going to join me in this conversation today, but she got called away for family things, so she couldn't be with us. But anyway, she and I had a nice conversation about all of this topic, and so some of this reflects that conversation I had with Glenetta, and some of it just is my observations about what's happened with education and our society as a whole as a result of the pandemic. So, but so anyway, she really wanted to be here because she wanted to see all of you folks. And she said her life has just been very, very crazy and busy and full and wonderful, but it's just been very difficult to reconnect with the church. So um, I want to start with a sort of like the macro view and then go down to education because I think in many ways our education systems are only a reflection of our communities. And we design our education systems to function in a certain way. And how they do function is very purposeful. It's part of the plan. Whether we like the results or not, that's what happens. And so I've always said that schools are nothing more than a reflection of the community they serve. And their schools are an indication of how the community values education. So I'm going to start with the macro first, but because mass national crises of this reveal many things about a society. And the 2021 pandemic is no exception to that. Whether we wanted to do it or not, we all learned many things about ourselves, our country, and the world. First and foremost, that we learned that our people and our institutions are really fragile. We are so fragile that a virus can paralyze almost all social interaction worldwide. We learned we are vulnerable to varying degrees because the institutions we designed to provide stability in the daily functioning of our society failed miserably in the face of this pandemic. We learned that the wealth inequality in our country and worldwide contributed mightily to the untold amounts of suffering and death for way too many people. The death toll and the ongoing chronic illness created by the pandemic hit people without surplus financial and social resources the hardest. And we learned that there are more people than we ever thought who suffer because of the obscenity of this wealth inequality and the systemic racism that permeates our society. We also learned that there was and is very little resolve among the people who could have changed this reality to do anything about it. They sat on their hands and let the ravages of our economy and the disease destroy many people. We also learned that despite all of this, people are resilient and many found ways to survive and support each other by a thread. People found community or created community in order to survive. Our church community here in Cincinnati and our household community provided that needed support for Lois and me. And it gave us the energy to stay connected to the world at large and to engage in ways that we didn't think possible at first. We safely made it to many protests of solidarity against police brutality throughout the summer and fall. We also safely engaged with a larger community of young political activists who gathered to meet on our property as they worked and planned each of the upcoming events related to the George Floyd protests and to everything else that was going on. And one of the things that we learned there is that their courage and tenacity and wisdom inspired us all. I, I can't say enough about how amazing these young activists are and how they thought through what they tried to do and how they could do it safely and how they dealt with the conflicts among each other and sorted those things out in ways far better than our generation of political activists ever hoped to accomplish that. So I have to give them so much credit, and it's just an amazing thing to have been an eyewitness to that And so I feel really privileged that we got to experience that. So all that I said about the pandemic and its impact on our society can be said about its impact on education and our children. And I want to give you just a list of some of the observations that I made and that Glenetta made in my conversations with her. Um, the pandemic served as a stark reminder of at least two things when it comes to education. First of all, that the nuclear family is not enough, and that schools can't be the sole safety net for the nuclear family. And that's a result of this ethos of toxic individualism that permeates our society. And that toxic individualism can't sustain families in such crises like this one. It's a shoddy stand-in for a more communal and federally subsidized support system that each of us and our society need to survive. Our schools are expected to fill all the gaps that the family cannot perform because we don't have any social support networks that are comprehensive enough to do that. Unlike some societies, we don't have available childcare. We don't have available food assistance. We don't have available income assistance. It took a gargantuan effort on the part of our federal government to actually enact some of that stuff. And they only did it because they were forced to do it, because the chaos and the crisis was so huge. So, like between March and May of 2020, food insecurity tripled. By March of 2020, October of 2020, 40% of all kids were living in homes where there wasn't enough food to eat at all. That's nationwide. 40% of our children could not find enough food to eat. When federal aid to schools finally came through, the Trump administration made sure that private schools, I'm talking about charter schools, parochial schools, private academies, they got 7 times as much money as the public schools did in relief. So non-public schools received on average about $855,000 per school to support them through this pandemic. Public schools got $134,000 per school on average. So you can start to see what's going on here with how privilege was subsidized in this situation, and public school children who comprise most of the children in need got the short end of the stick. And in a city like Cincinnati, the rate of childhood poverty pre-pandemic hovered around 40 to 50%. And that increased during the pandemic because of rent evictions, home foreclosures, and other family crises, even in the face of an effort to freeze all foreclosures and evictions. I had a number of students that I saw come through Hughes High School who their families were being evicted. They were losing their homes. Kids were couch surfing with other kids in the school. That's how they made it. Well, what about the educators? About half of all educators have school-age children. And 76% of all teachers are female. So it doesn't take a whole lot of conjecturing there to figure out that because 76% of all teachers are female, that doesn't take away their responsibility to be the prime child care provider because of the way our societies and families are organized. Women take up most of that responsibility. So there was that burden placed on many teachers, particularly if they were mandated to come in and teach in their particular school district, and their students and their kids went to another school district that maybe didn't meet or met remotely. They had to leave their kids, or they had to figure out some arrangement for their kids. And that was true for the students I had, that they would have to make arrangements for themselves. As institutions, our schools discovered that they cannot provide everything for their students. Now in Cincinnati, every student received a laptop computer. The distribution effort was gargantuan. If you can imagine distributing 37,000 laptops in 1 month or 2 months time period, that that was like the Berlin airlift. I mean, it was a huge, huge effort on the part of the school system to get laptop computers in the hands of each one of these students. And even if the student got a laptop then, a large number of them still didn't have internet access in their home. So the laptop was kind of useless for them if they couldn't connect to the internet and couldn't connect to the class time when they were learning remotely. So a lot of the students had to rely on their cell phones to connect to the classroom. And what that allowed them to do was to see and hear what was going on, but it really didn't allow them to interact in a meaningful way because their phones weren't that capable and they couldn't write papers. They couldn't submit stuff through their phone very easily. And it just was, it was very, very difficult for a number of students to do that because they were relying on their phones. Now, one thing I can say is that a family that might be in a homeless shelter, at least they probably had access to wireless internet. So the kids who were in the shelters probably were able to log on, which is an ironic twist of circumstance there. Because I taught photography and video production, we were able to get cameras distributed to all of our students. I'm pleased to report that we didn't lose a single camera and we didn't have any damage to any of the equipment that we gave out. And that access actually changed some of these kids pretty dramatically as they learned to express themselves through images and sound. So I was really happy that we were able to provide that kind of enrichment to kids in the middle of this crisis. Just getting a camera in the hands of the kids and teaching them the fundamentals of photography and how to frame a picture and visual language and sound and visual and the language of sound. It was really eye-opening for them. So it was a great experience in that regard. So what did the children learn? They learned way more about themselves and the world than we can give them credit. They learned that they're survivors. They learned how to manage households and younger siblings while they attended school remotely because many of their parents were essential workers and they had to go to work. They were working as custodians and they were working as food service workers and they were, working in areas where at Kroger store as an essential worker. And so they had to leave their kids at home. And so the high school students that I was working with, they were taking care of multiple siblings at the same time they were attending class. That kind of multitasking is a learned skill. They learned how to support each other and that they also learned that a little kindness goes a long way. I can't tell you how many times the kids, once we finally got them meeting remotely together, how much they supported each other. And even though we had social distancing restrictions, when they saw each other, they couldn't help themselves and they all started hugging each other. And that was a real touching thing, but it was also scary because we knew that our kids were probably the most vulnerable kids in terms of getting, in terms of their access or their ability to contract the disease. And a number of our kids did get COVID. Fortunately, none of our kids died, but some were on the verge of going to the hospital and were on oxygen. They also learned how to navigate a complex digital learning system and actually submit work, even when the digital capacity of the school system would frequently collapse from the demand. This is an institutional problem because Cincinnati Bell is responsible for building the network for Cincinnati Public Schools, but they would never have gotten away with the network that they constructed for the schools if they would have done that for Procter and Gamble or some larger corporation, because This network is a cobbled network that can't handle the capacity and is constantly collapsing underneath the demand. Unfortunately, my students also learned that the world is often cruel and our society cares very little about them. Now, as a teacher, I learned that my students are wonderful human beings. I learned that my students constantly amazed me with their ability to take on whatever came their way. That includes home evictions, that includes doubling up with another family and trying to make ends meet that way. Uh, Anything that includes looking over their shoulder because they're not documented and they're worried about being arrested and they've lived that way for 10 years or more, or that their parents were not documented and they were constantly worried whether their parents would be arrested and deported and they would be left behind because they were the citizens, but yet they needed their parents. Um, I also learned that my students have been damaged by this experience. And then I learned also that it's my job to help turn that damage into something else by unconditionally supporting and loving them no matter how many meltdowns occur in the classroom. And I can tell you that there were lots and lots of meltdowns because the pressure on our students was immense. And they were just all over the place at times because the, they had very little ways to express what was happening to them. And we had to give them the space to have the meltdown so that we could continue and work with them. And that's the kind of thing that builds resilience too, accepting the fact that meltdowns are part of life. And working your way through a meltdown and working on that and trying to figure out how to pull yourself together in front of your peers was a difficult issue, but it was one that we had to work with. I also relearned that this constant drive to quantify student knowledge and growth through biased standardized tests is a complete fool's errand. My kids are learning a lot, but they're not going to be able to demonstrate that on these stupid standardized tests that are all computerized and that are all multiple choice and that are extremely high pressure. And they were foisted on them at the end of this school year, and they all did, not all of them, but most of them did miserably on this because that was not what this school year was about. This school year was about trying to survive as a human being. And so the state legislature and the state board of education mandated that the schools must give these tests. And that was devastating for the students. And we had to give up 4 weeks of instructional time so that these students could sit in front of these computers and take these tests for 5 hours a day for 4 weeks. And you got to let that sink in as to what that does and how mind-numbing that is for students. Lastly, I learned that my students will be all right because I see evidence of that every time I read social media postings of my former students, particularly students that I thought would be struggling all of their lives. And I find out that they did pull it together. They did get their lives organized. They did appreciate the schooling experience they had in my classroom and other classrooms. And they did grow as human beings. And they went on to have families and they went on to lead happy lives and be productive in this society. So I end with that positive note because it's part of the resilience of the human spirit, I think. You know, we all have this drive to survive and we all have this desire to have community to help us do that. It's sometimes the structures of our society make it difficult and throw unnecessary obstacles in front of people who otherwise would accomplish more things in their lives than they already do. I guess one last thing too is that the problem in education is not the students. it's the adults. And because it's a system that's created by adults that kids have to navigate, and kids have very little say in how that system works. Now, I think the school that I've worked in all of these years, and I dearly love Hughes High School, has gone out of its way to try to figure out ways to empower students, because we know that so many aspects of their lives, they don't have any power at all. So I feel fortunate to have taught in a school like that. And I see so many wonderful things that have come from that school, even though by the standards of the state, we wouldn't be labeled a successful school. So I'm going to leave it at that. And oh, well, I talked way too long, 24 minutes. But why don't we, what do you think?
So now we can open it up to questions or comments. Tim, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I have a question. Did the state mandate that the charter and private schools had to take these same tests?
No.
No, that's what I thought.
Charter schools can be exempt, parochial schools are exempt. And the testing regimen is so onerous. One of the things I lamented when I was president of the teachers union was that I learned how this testing structure even gets started. And in kindergarten, the first experience that a student has in Cincinnati Public Schools is failure, because they're given a test that they're supposed to fail. And so a kindergartner walks in all excited about life and everything, and this test is thrown at them, and it's a test designed to make them fail so that the teacher can know what they need to teach. So their first experience with testing is failure.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it just is, and we as adults are responsible for that, not the kids.
Right, right.
Lynn, your hand is up.
Yeah, and please bear with the background noise. We're in a city neighborhood and there's lots of background noise. But so another consequence of the fact that particularly so many women who are teachers were also forced to make decisions about how to educate their own children is that there was a real shortage of available teachers to fill in for teachers, you know, that were taking time off. Our daughter is teaching in a Boston public school. She's a first year teacher. She just got her master's in environment or in library sciences. Couldn't find a job during COVID in that field, but was asked to take a classroom. The teacher was taking the semester off as a math and science teacher. So she's a first year teacher teaching two subjects she's never taught and doing it both virtually and in person. And there were the teacher left no curriculum materials for her. She didn't get a lot of support from teachers in school. So she really was doing it on her own. And even if she wanted to take time off or take a day off, there just were not substitute teachers to fill in for her. It really is amazing. And I know that's not unique to the school she's in. I think that was true all over the place.
And her co-teacher was teaching, I think, English and social sciences, all left through the end of the year a couple of weeks ago. So
and a first year teacher was
Right.
teaching two subjects. Yeah.
I mean, it's a perfect formula for burnout. I mean, and Tim talking about those kindergartners failing as soon as they get to kindergarten. I mean, you get a first year teacher in that situation, they're going to burn out real quick.
Yeah, we just hope our daughter still wants to teach after this experience, honestly.
I mean, her goal was for the kids to have a good day. And
Yeah.
most of the kids seemed to be having good days. I mean, that was the report from parents. And, you know, no, they didn't learn their algebra very well, but they had some good days.
I have to say that Cincinnati Public has tried very hard in recent years to try to make sure that there's a better matchup between teacher and subject material. There used to be a period of time in Cincinnati Public where teachers never got to teach subjects in their trained area. That I talked to mentor teachers when I first started teaching, said, first 10 years of my teaching career, I taught subjects other than what I was trained to teach. And I kept getting those assignments every year, and I would be surplused every year and moved around. So, and that's part of, that's a systemic problem where school systems start looking at teachers as interchangeable pieces in a machine instead of as human beings who have been trained to teach a certain topic.
Mhm. Do you think that districts and states will have learned from this experience for future emergencies or future situations where students can't always be in the classrooms?
I think there's some learning that's taken place, but unfortunately, education is a political football, and it's subject to the ideology of the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in no mood to cut public schools any breaks at all. And they're in no mood to change the course of direction that they've charted for schooling in Ohio. So I think it's difficult. It's up to the individual school districts, I think, to incorporate learning, the learning that they made this year and making adjustments. One of the problems I found with Cincinnati Public was that as an institution, it wasn't agile enough. It was so huge, so gargantuan to deal with this many students. But when decisions got made, there was no time to implement them. Teachers were told on a Thursday or a Friday that they were expected to be back in the classroom on Monday, and that they had to change their whole curriculum once.
Right, right.
And so this whipsaw kind of decision making. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that happened in Cincinnati Public, and it's typical to a lot of school districts, is that the political leaders of the school district, the school board, were more concerned about the image of what was going on than the substance of what was going on. And they were reading public opinion and making decisions based on public opinion rather than on what was good for students. Because they were trying to keep the wolf at bay politically and in public relations, rather than dealing and focusing on the issues of how do we educate these kids. So there's very little thought put into that. It just changed, and the delivery, the form of delivery changed at least 3 or 4 times in the course of the school year, with no more than a weekend's notice to do that change. So that, again, these are adult problems. These aren't kid problems.
All right.
Is the situation the same throughout Ohio?
Unfortunately, yeah. When I was the president of the teachers union, I met with the 8 teacher union leaders and the 8 superintendents of the largest school districts in Ohio. And I have to say, hands down, that Cincinnati Public was probably the best run of all of them. And that wasn't a compliment. It wasn't necessarily a compliment on Cincinnati Public. It's just that the rest of the school systems were in terrible, terrible shape. Toledo, Cleveland, Dayton, Columbus, Akron, Youngstown, the issues that they were dealing with were just amazing. Cincinnati Public now is about 85% of the student body was free and reduced lunch. Cleveland was 100% free and reduced lunch. And all the resources been drained out of the school system. In Dayton, there were more charter schools than public schools, and all the resources were drained from the school system. Toledo was a similar kind of problem where they were facing all of that. And Cincinnati Public was probably, we had the best test scores, we had the best of everything, partly because Cincinnati Public managed to figure out a way to keep white families in the school districts and middle-class families in the school district by providing Walnut Hills and SCPA
Right.
and the
Magnet
Montessori
school.
schools.
Right.
That was probably what saved Cincinnati Public in the long run from a lot of the devastation that occurred in the other school districts, because in Cleveland, it's 95% Black and Latino and Asian. And, 5% of the student body is middle class and white. And that just doesn't, you can't run a school district that way. It's truly segregated education. Now, Cincinnati has its own problems with segregation because we segregate our schools into the middle class schools and the low class schools. And the resource distribution is different in each one of those schools. The middle class schools have far more resources than the working class and lower class schools. Again, more adult problems.
I'm astounded by the number of hours that you said were devoted to testing. That's testing itself, not prep for the test.
Not prep for the test. In
Why?
some schools, that's all that happens throughout the whole school year is prepping for that 4 weeks of testing.
That's what I thought. But to have, basically, you were saying 100 hours of tests, required tests that are useless generally in terms of what you're trying to teach the rest of the year.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect between that. And it's all about trying to quantify stuff that's not very quantifiable. We have fooled ourselves into thinking that knowledge can be quantifiable and reliably quantifiable.
I'm trying to imagine how somebody in elementary or high school, how they could spend that much time testing, what the tests could be like that could cover that many hours of multiple choice.
I tell you, it's mind numbing, but that testing regimen doesn't exist at Walnut Hills. That testing regimen doesn't exist at SCPA.
Why?
Because they're not mandated to do the same amount of tests as low achieving schools.
Oh, it's based on the low achievement.
Based on, yeah, the quantum.
So it's counterproductive because the additional testing makes them even lower achievement.
Yeah,
And they don't, and that's determined at the Cincinnati level or at the state level.
well, that's state.
State, yeah.
And they just don't get it at the
There's
state.
a tremendous amount of resources devoted to testing.
And that's because the state legislature does not care about public education, and they want government to provide assistance to religious schools.
Well, it's really about what they consider accountability. They're saying we need to hold our school systems and our teachers accountable for what they're teaching. And you hold them accountable by punishing the students with testing regimens.
Well, I think we need to hold the state legislature accountable for going for a generation with an unconstitutional funding system for the public schools.
Oh, yeah. But, this testing craze started with Leave No Child Behind in 2001. And there were state tests prior to that, but the testing craze just got way, way out of hand.
Are other states doing a better job, or is this pretty much throughout the country as far as you know?
From what I could see, a lot of states are dealing with the same thing that Ohio is.
Yeah, I've taught in Kentucky for 30 years. And the same thing was true starting around 2000. The number of accountability tests that we had to give our students mushroomed. And it ended up taking up a large part of spring.
Yep.
Do Democratic legislatures around the country do a better job than Republican?
Not really. Arnie Duncan was as big a creator of the testing regimen under Obama's administration as was the people under the Bush administration or the Trump administration in terms of forcing the testing regimen. I think that the disconnect between both political parties and what education is about and how education is delivered is a pretty big disconnect. Doesn't matter which party you're from.
Well, and I think to be the most cynical, the cynical aspect of this is that there are a number of legislators that want to do away with public education. So what they'll try to do is prove that it's not working and shuttle money to charter schools, which don't have to take the tests. Where's the accountability there?
Well, that was Betsy DeVos's plan.
Yeah.
And had she gotten another 4 years in there, she would have really wreaked a lot of havoc. So there is a difference there between the Democrats and the Republicans on that issue in terms of how they see education policy working. Democrats tend to support public education more than private education. But even some Democrats are enemies of public education.
And the Democrats, you think, like the testing regime as much as the Republicans?
There's this whole drive for accountability it's a mythical thing. It's like that brass ring out there that you're trying to find the perfect test that evaluates all knowledge and everything. And they've deluded themselves into thinking that they can create that.
I thought that was changing a little bit, but you're discouraging us.
It's changing at the university level because a lot of universities now are no longer requiring SAT and ACTs because they recognize that those testing systems and regimens are flawed. But there's also a testing industry that lobbies politicians because they get a huge chunk of every school district's budget. We have to set aside a complete set of laptops that can't be used for anything but testing to protect the security of the tests. Then there are all these test prep people and test creation people who make tremendous contracts with school districts and state boards of education to administer and apply the tests. So there's a lot of money wrapped up in it.
Imagine what else that money could go towards.
Well, I know. Yeah, it's sort of like, this conversation is sort of like a window into the world of teaching in America and the frustration that many teachers face and why there's burnout and why there's cynicism. I think that by and large, most teachers that I run across have gone into the career for the right reasons, because they love kids and they want to impact kids' lives, and they do impact kids' lives, but they have to do it in spite of what the system does to it.
We're at 13 minutes past our allotted time. I think it's been a good discussion. I have one more question before we end, but is there Anybody else who didn't get to ask a question who would like to ask one before we close out? No? Okay, so Tim, I'm wondering for any parents out there who might view this later, what do you want them to know about their kids from this year?
I think first and foremost that parents need to recognize how wonderful their kids are. That they put up with a lot of messes that we adults have created for them. And they still manage to emerge as wonderful human beings. And I marvel at that. And I marvel at the fact that the kids are very forgiving. I mean, there's just an amazing amount of forgiveness on the part of students for the damage that's done to them. And I think that parents need to recognize that teachers, by and large, would not be in those schools unless they wanted to be in those schools. And teaching is a better profession than it used to be in terms of compensation, but it's still not that highly compensated that makes up for all of the anguish and frustration and the hours. When I taught full time, every day was a 12-hour day. And I did it because I loved the kids and I wanted to do the best that I possibly could for my kids. And that's true for so many teachers. So those are the messages, I guess, that your kids and your teachers are far more resilient and far more dedicated to their to growth than you would imagine.
Tim, thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciated all that you had to say.
Oh, thanks.
Me too. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you to you too, Meredith.
Thanks, Meredith.
All right. Have a
Bye-bye.
nice time off, Meredith.
Thank you. Bye.